Well, it's so good to see all of you. This is our last class. I was at a party, and the host of the party, I saw in the bookshelf of the host's bookcase at this party, I saw the first book that I ever published, and I was so amazed because I didn't know anybody had bought it, and I said to the host, I'm really so gratified. I didn't know anybody would have that book. And he looked rather sheepish. And he said, well, you should pull it out and take a look inside. And I pulled out the book and I looked inside, and the inside had been completely hollowed out. It was a safekeeping device. It had been sold as some place where nobody would ever pull out and open it. And you could put your jewelry in there. So a signed copy of one of my books is actually worth less on eBay than a regular copy. Last week, we talked about education and education policy and education generally in the context of it not being nearly as central, although very important, critically important, but not being quite as central as maybe you had thought it was. Because you can't look at education in a vacuum. You've got to look at education in context, in the context of differences in healthcare, differences in the environment, differences in access to everything that education brings you, differences depending upon your family's income and your family's wealth, differences in the quality of your life overall. And I emphasize this only because so much policy work over the last 20 years has emphasized education almost to the exclusion of everything else we've talked about in this class. Not that it's not important, but it needs to be set in a framework that is much larger. When we talked about education, I stressed to you that early childhood education, we know, because it's one of the few things that we've measured with very controlled experiments, randomized experiments, early childhood education has a huge return on public investment. And I emphasized last week public investment because there is a confusion when we talk about education as to what its actual purpose is. And we talked about this at some length. In fact, this was basically the theme last week. You can either look at education as a public good, that is the consequence of a public investment achieving a public return, or you can look at education as a private investment in which families and individuals are investing for their own stream of benefits in the future. And I wanted to, last week, stress with you that seeing education as a public good gets you to entirely different places, not only in terms of financing, but also in terms of where education appears in your constellation of policies, than it does when you see education as a private investment. A private investment is something that maybe other families and other people and other income groups don't necessarily want to invest in, because your private investment is going to pay off to some extent over your lifetime. And so student debt is not inconsistent with the notion of education as a private investment, but student debt and extraordinary expenses for higher education that go to and have to be paid by individuals and families becomes quite inconsistent with the notion of higher education as a public good. Now, today, we are going to be looking at the future of inequality, the future of our society and other societies also struggling with widening inequality. Just to make sure we're all on the page together, we're talking about inequalities of income and wealth and inequalities of power, because inequalities of income and wealth, you recall, necessarily connect to inequalities of power. And we're also talking about inequalities that are linked to race and ethnicity, because those inequalities are also almost inevitably linked to systemic racism and inequalities of power. You can't separate all of these various forms of inequality. And so today we will review very, very rapidly a kind of a key finding about the system. And remember, I stressed with you at the beginning of the semester that we're talking about a system. It's a political, economic system, but it's moving through time. History is extremely important in terms of understanding this. And the vicious and also virtuous cycles that are entailed in that understanding. And then the history and future of positive social change. And then the three elements of positive social change. And then leadership and positive social change. And finally, we're going to talk about you. And you. And you. And this is really a summary, because we've been here before. People with the right assets, that is education, race, ethnicity, gender, skills, connections, family wealth, and health, they get higher incomes in this system. Connections do matter, and increased wealth. And the vicious cycle means that high income and wealth give them more political influence, including political influence over the market. And this is a central theme that we've been developing in this course, is that there's no free market in nature. A market is a human creation. A market is very much a function of the laws and rules that enforce markets and decide what markets are going to be structured in terms of everything from the power of corporations over their own markets to set prices, the power of workers to come together with labor unions, rules having to do with what is private property, contracts, torts, and so forth. The market pre-distributes because of how those market rules are created. And the richest withdraw their support from public investment and social insurance. If this vicious cycle is allowed to get out of control, what you see is a secession of the successful, a secession from the public sphere into their own private spheres of separate institutions. We talked in the first half of the course about how to be truly rich in this society, particularly with a vicious cycle, any society, means you don't have to come across anybody who is not. And then people without the right assets, that is, without the right education, who are not in the dominant race or the right ethnicity or gender or skills or connections or family wealth or health or bad luck, they get lower incomes, lower wealth, they go into indebtedness, less social protection. Many face barriers of systemic racism. Others become angry at a rigged system because obviously they're working harder and they're not getting ahead, and they're looking for some reason for this, and some become susceptible to the politics of resentment, racism, xenophobia, and demagoguery. Now, this is a radically simplified version of the vicious cycle, but I put it up here to remind all of you of some of the dangers inherent in allowing some of the forces we've examined in this course to go completely unchecked. What is the alternative? Now, I want to be very careful today, as I have tried to be in this course, to give you data and analysis and arguments on both sides. To the extent that there are both sides, most issues actually have more than two sides. They have 3 or 5 sides. Positive social change, what do I mean by positive social change? This is a value-laden proposition, and I'll get to that in a moment. But I want to just give you a flavor of how vicious cycles turn into virtuous cycles, because it has happened again and again in our society. The struggle against systemic racism is a struggle that is endemic. It doesn't end. Our society began with the sin of slavery, the original sin of slavery, and that has characterized our history. You can see, and I don't have to explain each of these, because you hopefully understand enough about our history to know what these photographs actually represent. This is a picture taken in the late 60s in the South, where white and black students came together to register voters right after civil rights and voting rights. And I think I shared with you my own personal story about how, because I was very short always in my life, I needed and often found older boys to protect me from the bullies. And how one of those older boys, when I was about 7, when he was, I want to say, about 13 or 14, he protected me from the bullies. Well, when he got to be 22, he was registering voters in Mississippi, along with 2 other civil rights workers. And he was viciously tortured and murdered. And I think it changed my life to know that the bullies were not just people who picked on people who were different or weaker. The bullies were actually, if they weren't constrained, were capable of doing heinous damage, killing. His name was Mickey Schwerner, by the way. This is Johnson signing the Civil Rights Act. Well, you know and you are aware of these moments in history. I never thought we would have a black president. I happened to be in Chicago. I think I maybe shared this with you. I was in Chicago the morning after President Obama became elected. He was president-elect. And I was advising him, and I got a call from his campaign, and it said, come to the such and such hotel in downtown Chicago. Well, I was already there. I came right down, and he came into the room, and there were about 12 of us sitting around a table, and he shook each of our hands, and I had prepared a little sentence to kind of congratulate him. And as he came around, and he, with this huge smile on his face, and he shook my hand, and he said, "Bob, how are you today?" I literally could not speak. And my eyes filled up with tears, and I felt so stupid. And on it goes. And there is a fight for gender equality as well, and it has gone on for a very, very long time. My father was born in a time when women did not have the right to vote in the United States. And the movement for gender equality obviously continues. It has not stopped. It continues with fits and starts. I remember when we thought it was amazing that there was a female justice of the Supreme Court. How could that possibly be? Workers' rights. At the start of the last century, we as a nation took for granted that child labor was a necessity. I never heard anybody make that argument, but I read about these arguments. Obviously, so the argument went, children at the age of 10 or 11 or 12, they needed to be in the workforce to support families. Otherwise, how are families going to survive? And the movement for unions. Women workers joining with black workers. Joining together. Martin Luther King seeing the link between racial justice and economic justice. Cesar Chavez, the grape strike. And on it goes. The movement for gay rights, LGBTQ+. It was not that long ago. Again, in my lifetime, I remember people being arrested and put into prison because they were gay or lesbian. It seems hard to imagine. But in my lifetime, people were frightened to come out. Because coming out meant not only did you violate social norms, you were a criminal. You were a criminal and you could lose not only your freedom, but sometimes your life. The anger that I mentioned before about people confronting a system that was no longer rewarding them for the past 45 years, as we've seen in this course. The bottom half of American workers, in terms of income, have not had a raise adjusted for inflation. People don't realize that and how different that is from what came before. Even this morning, I was reading an article in today's New York Times that said, well, workers are doing wonderfully well. Workers are not doing wonderfully well. Workers are continuing to lose ground. The median worker in the United States losing ground to inflation. Yes, inflation is high, but although the workers are getting wage increases adjusted for inflation, those wage increases are actually losses. The Tea Party movement, the Occupy movement, Bernie Sanders movement. Here at Berkeley, the Occupy movement was a very major event, a very major movement, but it did have the virtue that it put on the table ideas and proposals and actions that are now considered to be more mainstream than ever before. At the time Bernie Sanders was talking about this, they appeared to be radical. What can sometimes seem impossible, like the idea that children should be in school rather than in factories. The idea that gay people should be allowed to marry can change dramatically. Donald Trump was elected in 2016, in part, the research shows us, focus groups show us, focus groups that I did in 2015 and 2016, a lot of people were very supportive of Donald Trump in 2015 and 2016 because he was anti-establishment, because he said the system is rigged against you. hourly worker, non-college worker, and I am going to be your voice, he said. Now, we can have a debate about how much of a voice he was for hourly workers. But he was clearly responding, and people were responding to him in the sense of that backlash against the establishment. And that backlash continues today. The question is it going to be channeled in constructive ways? Or is it going to be channeled in destructive ways? Is it going to enhance our capacity for self-government, or is it going to reduce our capacity for self-government? Well, it gets to the normative underpinnings of positive social change. There are three elements of positive social change. Widening gap between the ideal and reality. That is, all of us, or most of us, are brought up, or we come to have certain ideals about what society should look like, what it should value, how it should be. And there is always a gap between those ideals and what is, in fact, the reality. But to the extent that there's broad public knowledge of that gap, then we have the possibility for positive social change. But you need one third element. It's not enough that there are ideals. It's not enough that there's a gap and people are broadly aware of the gap between the reality and the ideals. You need something else. And that something else is widespread sense of efficacy. People have to feel that they are able to change, able to reduce the gap. For example, if we looked at income distribution, particularly with regard to distribution of wealth, what would you prefer? And this gets right now to you in terms of your voting. I'm going to give you a distribution of wealth A and then distribution of wealth B, but you can see distribution of wealth A right here. And this is basically shows you that most of the wealth is going to the top 20%, and the next 20% gets this percentage of the wealth, and you can see the bottom 20% gets a very little bit of percentage of wealth. And here is the alternative. Alternative B is a more equitable distribution of wealth. And which do you prefer, A or B? Go. Think, do you prefer A or B? And it turns out that most of you prefer B because you prefer a more equitable distribution. And it's not just Berkeley. In fact, if we look to the next slide, we can see, according to most Americans, the ideal distribution is exactly what you just said. Most Americans feel that the ideal distribution is this. It's more equitable than the alternative. But then people think that the actual distribution is A. When you actually take polls of people, and this is actually based on a true study, most people think the actual distribution is this. So people do have an ideal of what the distribution should be. They see that there's a gap between the ideal and the reality, but they don't understand some very important piece of it. The real distribution is this. If people understood this was the real distribution, there might be more interest in doing something about it. So the first element of social change is certainly achieved. There are ideals, and there is actually quite a lot of consensus about what the ideal is. But the second A broad understanding and knowledge of the gap between the ideal and the reality is not yet there. But there is also increasingly a sense of inefficacy, a sense that, well, I can't do anything about it, which is where leadership comes in. Now, there are some myths about leadership, and I want to go over with you. There's the myth of the natural born leader, the myth that the leaders are born. Well, I'm not a leader because I don't have the charisma, or I never had it. I'm not a leader because I was just not born with the qualities of leadership. She has leadership. I don't have leadership. That is wrong. Leaders are not born. There are not inherent qualities of leadership. Leadership comes from a very different place. We'll see in a moment. There's myth of leadership as followership. Well, you know a leader because the leader stands out as somebody who has a lot of followers. Whether it's Twitter, no, that's not real leadership. Or whether it's somebody who just has a lot of people willing to do whatever he or she says, but that can't be leadership. That's not a normative view of leadership. Some of the worst dictators, totalitarians, fascists in the world have had a lot of followers. If we want a normative theory of leadership, a theory of leadership that has real values attached to it, that has positive social values attached to it, it cannot be simply having a lot of people willing to follow you. And it cannot also be a third mythology, that leaders are only the people who hold high office. In fact, I can say to you, honestly, as somebody who was in a president's cabinet, in many ways, you have less capacity to lead when you're in a high office because you have all the baggage that comes with that high office, all the responsibilities that are inherent in that high office. You can certainly do a lot, but there's a big difference, I want to stress, between authority, formal authority, and informal authority, between leadership and authority. So what is leadership? What's my definition of leadership? What's a definition that actually has a normative content, that actually embraces the values, some of the values we have been talking about, I've certainly been talking about today? Leadership is helping people join together to do the hard work of making positive social change. Leadership is overcoming work avoidance. Do you know what I mean when I say work avoidance? Anybody ever found themselves in this? All of us are guilty of some form of work avoidance. All of us. We would not be human. We could not even function during our normal daylight hours if we were not somehow avoiding some work. But from the standpoint of a society, from the standpoint of the future and survival of the planet and civilization, work avoidance is dangerous and it's also inevitable. Every morning when I come into work, I pass homeless people on the street, and there are more and more of them. What do? Well, very occasionally, I will provide one or two with a little bit of change or money, but am I going to dedicate myself to getting homeless people off the street in Berkeley? I can't. I cannot do that work. I cannot do that work and do everything else I want to do. I cannot do that work and have a family. I can't, friends. I can't do that work emotionally. That is work avoidance. Leadership on, say, the issue of homelessness is helping me and others overcome that work avoidance mechanism, is getting us engaged in solving the problem, whatever the problem is. Or let's make it more personal. Let's say, for the sake of the argument, let's say you have a roommate who has an eating disorder or a problem with a relationship, an abusive relationship. Now, what do? You could possibly talk to your roommate. You could possibly summon your roommate's other friends. You could actually have a strategy for helping your roommate, but maybe you don't have the time. Maybe you don't want to make the effort. Maybe you just can't deal with it. You are avoiding a certain kind of work that is important, but I am not blaming you for that. There are 4 work avoidance mechanisms. And as a leader, what you do as a leader, whether you know it or not, consciously or not, you overcome each of these work avoidance mechanisms, given the issues that you are dedicated to. Number 1 work avoidance mechanism is denial. Denial that your roommate is in an abusive relationship. Denial that there are homeless people and more homeless people. Denial that the climate is getting worse and worse and changing, and indeed it's not going to be survivable, and it's caused by humans. Denial that the problem exists. You as a leader, your job is to overcome denial. Your job as a leader is to help people see reality. Organizations, groups, communities, even nations spend a lot of time and effort denying. One of the methods of denial, actually, that you're going to come across, I'm sure, when you do a job search. There are a lot of jobs out there that have the word relations in them. Do you know what I'm talking about? Community relations, shareholder relations, university relations, investor relations, customer relations. Now, all of these relations jobs are, I say all, most of them are, in fact, heat shields. They're designed, and people in the jobs are actually, if you unpack what they are there to do, their actual purpose is to calm down a group. Community relations, keep the community appeased. Take the heat and don't let the heat affect the people who really have the power. In fact, the people who have the power are hiring the relations people to keep the people who have the power from feeling the heat. Beware the relations jobs. How can you become a change agent and a leader when there's a lot of heat in the system? Well, instead of being a heat shield, you become a heat conductor. I'm using metaphors here, but maybe I should boil this down to reality of individual people. Some of my former students, for example, let me introduce you. This is Veronica Cummings. Veronica Cummings, my student a few years ago. Veronica, well, she had the choice of becoming a heat shield. She is now stakeholder investment lead in Oakland. What does that actually mean? Well, day by day, what Veronica is doing is mobilizing people in the community. Rather than being a heat shield for the city of Oakland or for the Oakland A's or for any particular actor in Oakland, what Veronica is doing is going around and seeing where is the heat in Oakland and how can I help people get together and mobilize so that they have a bigger say. Not an easy job. But if you're a heat shield, I can assure you, heat shields eventually melt. Work avoidance mechanism number 2. Remember, number 1 is denial. Number 2 is escapism. Oh, well, yes, I'm not denying that my roommate has an abusive relationship. I'm not denying that they're homeless people. I'm not denying that the earth is warming, and I'm not denying that people are responsible for global warming. I'm not denying that widening inequality is occurring. But you know something? It's not my problem. I can escape from the problem. I and everybody I love can escape from the problem. My family can escape from the problem. So while I understand it intellectually, and I feel something because I'm an empathic person, I don't have to take action. A leader will help people overcome the natural tendency for escapism. How do you do that? Well, again, I chose a couple of my former students. This is Andrew Lewis. Andrew is on the Seattle City Council. I talked to him recently. What Andrew is doing is basically saying to a lot of people in Seattle, look, gig workers in Seattle are just like you. In fact, they are your children or they are your relatives, and we've got to have a minimum wage that helps every gig worker live in Seattle, gives every gig worker in Seattle enough money. Andrew is saying to people, you can't escape because they are you. They are among the people you love. Another one of my former students also happened to be in Seattle. This is Karen Martin. She's a professor of criminal justice. What she is doing is finding that fees and fines imposed on a lot of poor people are creating enormous burdens and hardships that create their own vicious cycle. But what Karen is managing to do is helping people see that it's not just them. They can't escape from this because this fees and fines cycle affects everybody in an area, everybody in the community. It has attached to it social problems that grow and affect everyone. Work avoidance mechanism number 3. Remember, the first is denial. The second is escapism. The third, that a leader intuitively overcomes, is scapegoating. Scapegoating. That is, I accept. I'm not denying that the problem exists. I am not escaping from the problem. I know that it affects me, but you know something? The problem is really with those people. Those people are the reason we have this problem. Those people. Scapegoating. Scapegoating is one of the oldest methods of work avoidance. Let me introduce you to one of my former students, Min Dang. She started and still is working in, as far as I know, a non-for-profit called Don't Sell Bodies. Min came to Berkeley as an undergraduate, and she is from a family of refugees. And she discovered when she was at Berkeley that, and I'm not blaming anybody, and she never blames anybody, but her family had sold her into slavery as a sexual trafficking victim when she was very, very young. And what she discovered in Berkeley is that that was not normal. And that astonishing, horrible revelation changed not only her life, but also dedicated her life, made her dedicated to making sure that others did not fall into the trap of sex trafficking, that people understood their rights, that people understood that they didn't have to do this, and that others did not blame and scapegoat people who were caught in this. And finally, work avoidance mechanism number 4, which in many ways is the most subtle and worst. And leaders have the most challenging time overcoming this. And this is cynicism. That is, even if people agree that there is a problem that needs to be solved and they don't feel like they are escaping from it. In fact, they understand that they're affected by it, and they're not blaming anybody else. They're not scapegoating. They really don't believe that anything can be done. They believe that it's always going to be there, or that the system doesn't allow change. There is always cynicism. But the leaders who looked at child labor in 1905, the people who looked at the fact that women did not have the right to vote, the people who were aware that gay and lesbian people were being locked up, the people who did not accept the reality of so much that seemed unjust, were unwilling to be cynical. Cynicism is a luxury. It is a work avoidance mechanism. How do you avoid cynicism? Well, there's no easy way of avoiding cynicism. One way, though, that we are in the academy trained to help others overcome cynicism is by giving them evidence, giving them data, giving them the truth. And it's not just overcoming denial, it is actually enabling them to see that there are paths to reform. There are ways to do better. One of my former students here, Kate Glassman, she works for the university. She works with numbers. She works all day looking at a computer screen, but what she actually does, her real job, is to fortify those who want to believe that there are better ways that the university can use its scarce resources. That the cynicism about, well, we can't do anything because we don't have the money. We can't do anything because this is the way it's always done, she is helping to overcome. Having said all this, I should also caution you about 3 temptations of leadership. And what do I mean? Messianism. Now, how can I best express this to you? When you are in a position of leadership, when you do feel like you are moving people, when you feel as if there is the possibility that you can affect change and help others affect change, there is a danger that you will allow others to treat you as if you are, in effect, a Messiah. You are the change agent. They will in effect, they will use you as a work avoidance mechanism by investing in you all of the power and all of the authority and all of the magic of making social change or making change. I remember when I was Secretary of Labor, I was giving a speech to a very large group. This must have been about 8,000, 10,000 people. They were union members. I wanted to fire them up. I wanted to give them hope. I wanted to overcome kind of cynicism. And I gave a speech in which I asked one of my assistants to please, halfway through the speech, put this music on very, very gently, very quietly, before people recognized that it was on, and gradually increase the sound of the music. Because I wanted to build up to a crescendo. I wanted the people to not only hear my words, but hear the emotional impact. And music is a wonderful way of feeling and hearing emotional impact. Stories are as well. But I was, well, do you remember, it's from Les Mis. It goes, dee, 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 dee. You know that one? When you hear the people, when you dee, 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 dee. Can you please help me? When you hear the people sing, Okay, stop. Okay, now I'm going to... Very good, very good. Now I'm going to give you the speech, or a little piece of what I was saying to this group. Remember, it's 8,000 to 10,000 people. And this music starts very quietly, and as I signal to you, just bring it up, right? In the background of what I say. So I'm going to signal with my hands. So this is going to be start, and then this is going to be increase the, all right, okay. I've got to get in the mood. Okay. And so I say to you, members of the AFL-CIO, that what you need to do, what you have a moral obligation to do, is to go out and organize, empower, energize workers around America to understand their obligations and their rights. And you, members of the AFL-CIO, you can do this if you understand deeply and powerfully, and you are committed to making the world a better place. And by the time I finished, 8,000 to 10,000 people were standing on their chairs, yelling and screaming and applauding. And I felt terrific. That feeling, that dopamine rush, is a signal that you as a leader are failing. Because you, as a leader, you are celebrating their celebration of you. They are seemingly responding to you, but it's responding to you. They are not being empowered. Do you understand the difference between messianism and leadership? It's a subtle difference, because in our society, we very often assume that somebody who is rousing a crowd, giving tremendous speeches, exuding enormous energy, getting people excited, that is leadership. That often is a way in which the crowd becomes just a crowd, loses responsibility, loses consciousness, and loses a sense of their own autonomy and gives responsibility to the leader. It's dangerous. Martyrdom is another danger. And here I can tell you my own personal story is that I often found myself in my 30s and 40s working all the time. I would get up in the morning and I would work 12 or 13 hours. And I liked the idea that I was working all the time. I liked the feeling, the rush of being, in effect, a martyr. In effect, somebody who was sacrificing my life. I didn't understand it in these terms, obviously, but I was working so hard that I was allowing other people around me to put the burden of the work on me because they knew I would be working 12 or 13 hours or 14 hours and working on weekends. And the problem with martyrs is that they always burn out. They don't have whole lives. That is not leadership. Martyrdom is a substitute for leadership. And finally, marginalization. What do I mean by marginalization? I mean that if you ever get to the point where you are in let's say a meeting, and people begin ignoring you, or you are talking to somebody or a group of people and they begin rolling their eyes, or you are walking down a street and you want to sell a particular idea to somebody and they walk to the opposite side of the street. Those are all clues that you are being marginalized because you're so predictable, because you are so obsessive compulsive about this one issue that everybody knows what you're going to say. When I was in the Clinton administration, after a couple of years, everybody knew that Reich was going to bring up the issue of distributional equity. No matter what the issue was, Reich was always going to put up his hand and say, but have we really thought about how this affects the poor? He is so predictable. Well, you might think that that is a change agent approach. No. When you're marginalized, you're allowing people to ignore you. How do you avoid being marginalized? Maybe you be a little bit unpredictable. Maybe you say something that people don't expect. Maybe you put it in a new way. Maybe you hold your tongue. Which brings us to you. To you. You know, when I was in Washington, and I've spent a lot of time in Washington, but when I was in Washington, occasionally I would get a little bit stressed and a little bit anxious and a little bit overwhelmed, and this is inevitable. I would wander into the National Gallery of Art. I had been an art history major when I was an undergraduate. And so I have always taken a great deal of comfort from art, particularly paintings. And I would go to the National Gallery of Art, and there was one room in that National Gallery that featured four paintings by a Hudson River School romantic painter of the 1840s named Thomas Cole. Now, I can't tell you why his paintings touched me, but they did. And these four paintings were entitled The Voyage of Life. And I'd sit there in the middle of a small room looking at these four paintings, and I would think about the voyage of life. I want to share them with you because this is an appropriate time. The early years. Well, there you are. You are in this lovely little boat. That's not you with your hand on the till. That's an angel. You are the little baby. You see yourself? And you are so joyous and you were so happy. And that little boat you're in, the little chalice, is gold. It has full decorations. It is gorgeously crafted and sculpted. And the angel is taking care of you. And the angel is guiding that little boat. And the world is beautiful. You are coming into an extraordinary experience. You would describe your early years as A, blissful, blessed, extraordinarily fortunate, or B, uneventful, normal, sometimes even boring, or C, a struggle, extremely hard, amazing, I made it through. Okay, let's end the bidding and let's just see what you think. Well, 65% of you, 65% of you say it was blissful and blessed and extraordinary fortunate, but for some of you it was sort of uneventful and boring. And there are a number of you, 20% it was a struggle, extremely hard, amazing, you're amazed you made it through. And there are maybe 2 of you that don't even show up. All right. Well, we all have slightly different histories here. Let's take a look at Thomas Cole's second painting of the series. And here you are on your own. And there on the riverbank is your angel. That's actually University of California, Berkeley, saying goodbye. And you have your hand on the tiller. You see, you're in charge. You will have power. You're moving gently and in a very, very comfortable way. And look at the distant, look at the future, look at the possibilities. There are temples, there are mountains, there are beautiful vistas. You have the world at your possible disposal. It's not going to be all easy by any means, but you have agency, you have effectiveness, you have power, you have everything that the best public university, if not the best university in the world, is going to give you. So goodbye and good luck. You would describe yourself now as A, hopeful and upbeat with quite a good idea of where you're heading and what you want to do, or B, hopeful but no real clue where you're heading and what you'll be doing, or C, anxious and worried about the future holds for you. Go. Okay, let's end the bidding there and see what you feel. Well, most of you, 54%, you are hopeful, but you don't have a clue. And about a quarter of you are on one side, hopeful and upbeat, and 21% of you are anxious and worried. But that's all pretty much to be expected. So what's the next stage? What does Thomas Cole think is the third painting? Well, it's rough out there, I admit. I mean, the river has turned into a really raging rapids, and it's hard. Life is hard, and you may sometimes find yourself just in desperation. You're going to have to, I don't know, you look like you're praying. There's no longer a tiller, by the way. You have your hand on nothing. I mean, and the rapids are even getting worse, and look at that rain, the tumult, look at the trees. I mean, everything has gone to, well, it's really, the thing is that you are going to fail. I mean, you're not going to be desperate, but hopefully, but you're going to fail. And you'll fail and fail and fail. I mean, that's what is inevitable. If you don't fail, you haven't tried. If you haven't tried, you have no courage. And it's a waste. But a failure is not death-defying. Most failures are simply noble experiments that have not worked. The real issue for you is your resilience. It's not whether you're going to fail, it's whether you're going to, and how quickly and how easily you're going to bounce back from failure. So Thomas Cole was pretty pessimistic, and I have to admit, there have been times in my life when I felt just like this. You would describe yourself as flexible and resilient, easily able to bounce back from defeats, or be reasonably steady, but you can get thrown by setbacks or failures and take a while to regain your footing. Or C, you're incredibly hard on yourself. You take every downturn very personally, and you absolutely hate to fail. But go. Well, again, we have a kind of a fairly similar curve here. That is, a little over half of you think you're reasonably steady, but you can get thrown by setbacks, obviously, and failures. You can regain your footing, but you're realistic about yourself in terms of how difficult it has been. And then there's some of you who say, that is about 22% of you say, you're flexible, you're resilient, you're easily able to bounce back from defeats. And then there's about, I would say more than 25 or 26% of you who say you're incredibly hard on yourself. Every downturn you take personally, you hate to fail. Well, all I have to say to you is change. No, it's easy to say change. I simply mean that resilience is often learned, and often learned painfully. It's necessary, not easy. And so let's take a look at Thomas Cole's last painting. Well, there you are. You've survived, I suppose. Your boat looks like it's just about to sink. There's no rudder. In fact, it's barely there. And you have an angel who's telling you to follow her. There are other angels. But the issue, I suppose, is what do you want to look back on? Mary Oliver, I don't know how many of you, I love Mary Oliver's poems. This is from one of her poems. Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? What is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? I should say that you, as somebody who is either graduating soon or you have already come and been a student here at this wonderful institution, you were already good at, and have to be good at, mastering some domain of information and knowledge. You wouldn't be here if you weren't. You've already gained additional skills at doing that. And you're also very good at jumping through hoops. That is, doing assigned tasks. You're really good at it. And you're really good at getting kind of standard feedback in terms of tests and appraisals and evaluations. These are things that you learned probably very early on. You probably got a lot of the skills in high school, and you certainly, higher education has given you more. But here's the thing. Once you leave here, or even graduate school, you're going to have to do all of this for yourself. That is, the domain of information and knowledge you're going to have to decide on. It's not going to be assigned. And the hoops that you jump through, you're going to have to decide what those hoops are going to be, because there's not going to be anybody giving you a hoop. Well, there may be an employer who says do this or do that, but those employers will not know any of the details, so you are going to have to be the designer of your own hoops, your own assignments. And getting standard feedback, isn't going to be standard feedback. You're going to have to decide what feedback out there you want. You may have to create your own feedback systems. You may have to actually ask other people for the kind of feedback you think you need and feedback you think you want. Increasingly, you're going to need, in other words, self-knowledge. Your own hoops, your own feedback. And basically, also the old career ladder that we examined in this course. Starting with a high-volume, standardized mass production system, well, that old career ladder, you moved through a sequence of fairly predictable steps within the same organization or industry or skill set, and that added responsibilities and widening span of control. But the new career path has nothing to do with that old career path. The chances are you're going to spiral. Hopefully, you're going to spiral upward. Occasionally, there are going to be downward spirals. There's different roles and different organizations. And you're going to gain some mastery, and maybe you'll take it into different roles and different organizations, and you're going to have to develop different skill sets over time, adding over time as you cycle through different organizations or different positions or different degrees of responsibility. You have to add your own judgment and insight. You see how much of this has to do with your own self-knowledge. That's what I want to stress. Because those of us on the faculty here at Berkeley, we can help give you what we know and help develop your own knowledge, but we can't really help you sharpen your self-knowledge. That's the biggest challenge. The kind of work you most enjoy in terms of self-knowledge, is it negotiating, getting to an agreement, or is it thinking, analyzing hard problems, or is it advocating, is it selling, making a case, or is it organizing, getting into the details and operationalizing something? What do you think the kind of work you most enjoy is? Go. Oh, inspiring. Okay, let's end the bidding there, and let's take a look. Well, you are spread over all of those options. Most of you, not surprisingly, it is analysis, it's thinking. That's what you have done in your education so far. Not surprising that that's what you think you are good at and what you think you would enjoy, but chances are you're going to do some of all of these, and chances are you don't yet know exactly what you most enjoy or what you are best at yet, because you just haven't had a chance to develop or flex those muscles. Self-knowledge is about keeping track of yourself as you develop these muscles. Another aspect is your major personality drug. Now, let me explain. All of us has at least one personality drug. By personality drug, I mean, and I define that as something you cannot get enough of. You can never be entirely satisfied. Something that you always want more of. And it's something that inevitably gets you in trouble. It trips you up. It causes problems for you. Those are the two definitions I use of a personality drug. Something that is insatiable, and secondly, something that will and already has probably caused you some problems. So here are the major personality drugs that you can choose from. One is, I want it now. The second is, I want to be loved. The third is, I want to be in control. The fourth is, I want to be the smartest person in the room. Now, does anybody recognize any of these? Now, you have to choose. I know all of them are very attractive, but I'd like you to choose your major personality drug in terms of it's insatiable and it trips you up. Go. Okay, let's end the bidding. Let's end the bidding now. Well, all I can say is to be loved, to be in control, and to be perfect. That sounds about right. Now, I've done this personality drug test several years in a row. Almost every class before yours has overwhelmingly chosen B. I think that's interesting. Well, the reason this is useful, and this is part of self-knowledge, I don't want you to feel like you've got to get rid of this personality drug. I mean, this is not a matter of spending a fortune on psychiatrists. No, the value of knowing your own personality drug is because you can be on the lookout for when you're in the gravitational pull of that drug. And when you are, be careful. Tread lightly. Move around it. It's human. You're human. But just be aware that there are these insatiable needs that cause problems. And then finally, and again, these clickers are wonderful because nobody knows this is anonymous except for the CIA and the administration here at Berkeley. They also are watching, and no, they don't. Nobody knows what you... So to be completely honest, I think I am most want to look back on my life and say I was famous and celebrated, or B, I made the world a better place, or C, I had wonderful friends and family, or D, I had great wealth. Go. End the bidding and let's see. So most of you, I had wonderful friends and family, and many of you, I made the world a better place. They're not mutually exclusive, but there is a tension. When I was Secretary of Labor, I had to leave my family for 4.5 years. I had 2 small sons at that time. I missed them terribly. And I kept telling myself, well, I'm making the world a better place. At the margin, I'm trying to. But I tried to get home on weekends. Finally, after 4.5 years, I had to go and say to Bill Clinton, the day I went into his office, the Oval Office, closed the door behind me, and I said, when we were alone together, I could call him Bill. I said, Bill, I've got to go home. This is the best job I've ever had, but this is the best family I've ever had. And I can't have both. And he said, I understand. And so I went home, and the boys, well, they were happy to see me, but they had their friends, and they had other things to do. I remember Adam, my older son, at that time was a cross-country runner. I was so happy to be able to go to his cross-country races. And I remember the first cross-country race. It was raining. We were in Cambridge, Massachusetts. They all took off. I had an umbrella, wasn't working very well. And I stood there in the rain, alone. He was off running. I was standing there in the rain, alone. And I thought, I could be in Washington making big choices and big decisions. And now I'm standing in a puddle. But it was the right decision. None of these choices is easy. And we come to you. There are no more slides. I've run out. You have to supply the next slides. But let me just say a few things. I said to you at the beginning of this course that there were two objectives I had for you in teaching this course. One was to give you a deeper understanding of wealth and of poverty and of why the gap was widening, not only in the United States, but elsewhere around the world. I wanted you to question your assumptions. I wanted you to be better informed, but also more aware. That was my first objective. I told you I would share with you my second objective at the end of the course. And so I am going to share it with you now. I teach this course not because I have nothing else to do. I have many other things that I could do with my life, but I am here in this course with you because I believe in you. I believe that not all of you, but some of you are going to make the world better. I believe that some of you, not all of you, and not all of your time, but some of you, some of your time, you are going to be trying to be a leader. I believe that many of you understand by now that you don't have to be Secretary of Labor to be a leader. You don't have to have formal authority to be a leader. To make the world better, you need only to have a moral compass and tenacity and an understanding of yourself and of others. You have to be a person of empathy. I'm here because I believe you have those qualities. Speaking of which, I want to ask onto the stage for our thanks a group of people who have all of those qualities. I chose them because they had the qualities. Your GSIs, please. And let me just say, as they are coming on the stage, a special thanks to Mariel Mendoza and also to Michael Wiafe. And a special thanks also to two people who are behind the scenes, who you probably have not met, but they make this work. And without them, we would not even be here. One is my assistant, Aaron Walker. And also the person who is in charge of all of the technology here, not only in this room, but really much of Berkeley, who gets none of the praise he deserves, and that's Ezra Daly. Ezra. So finally, my students, my friends, may your days be filled with wonder. May your work be filled with meaning. And may your lives be filled with joy. Thank you.
And I stumble to the kitchen, pour myself a cup of ambition and yawn and stretch and try to come to life. Jump in the shower and the blood starts pumping. Out on the street, the traffic starts jumping with folks like me on the job from 9 to 5. Working 9 to 5.